Death is Trenchy and Verdun is Stenchy. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is February the 26th, 2021. And on this date in history, in 1993, Al Qaeda bombed the World Trade Center tower, this time from within. They sent a large U-Haul packed with explosives, and it blew a hole in, I want to say, 3 floors. The one that was on, one or two above and one below. Uh, anyway, everyone have a great day. Now, if you remember on the last episode of Notes, World War I broke out. Germany had a plan to defeat France quickly and then to go fight Russia. Whenever they were bottlenecked in France, they did the only thing they could, which was go to war with Russia. So Russia had some major problems. One, they didn't have a good way to transport goods. They didn't have standardized railroad track, so you had to transport from one train to another. So the majority of things taken to the front were taken by ox cart. Two, they didn't have a good communication system. So while other countries had moved to the point where they had codes and that no one really had all the battle plans except for 3 or 4 of the top generals, the Germans sent full caches of all their plans, broadcast on the radio exactly what they were going to do instead of, if you and I are fighting someone, I don't say, hey, go sneak up behind them while I have their attention in the front. What you might say is 58 gray arrow, and that might mean to go and sneak up behind them and to kill the other side. Not only that, but they didn't have food for their troops most of the time. They didn't have guns, and even if they did have guns, they didn't have ammunition. So Russia goes to invade Germany, and almost everyone is going to surrender in a short period of time because they hear that that they feed their prisoners and they weren't being fed in the army. In fact, to put things in better, to make this make more sense, the Germans only sent 135,000 against a Russian force of 650,000, and the only Russians that broke through were the ones that were going in to surrender. Other than that, there was not really much of a threat at all posed by the Russians on the Germans. Now, the Austrian Hungarians, that was a much different matter. Now, the Battle of Tannenberg. So, the invasion of Prussia or Germany went horribly for the Russians. They had 30,000 deaths and 92,000 troops captured. Again, remember, going into the battle, they outnumbered the Germans by more than 5 to 1. This victory at Tannenberg will actually stop the Russian invasion, and it was not even close at any point. There was never really any jeopardy of Germany losing this battle or this fight. Now, there were many great innovations that were introduced in World War I. One of those is the Zeppelin, and you might look at that and think, how on earth could that be any use during a war? And what this did was it made it possible for them to see exactly where all the troops were on the other side. So they could radio that down, and then the Germans would know exactly where Britain and France were attacking from. The machine gun. This really completely changed trench warfare. Now, trench warfare was started in the Civil War and also to an extent in the Crimean War. And during that time, it was believed that if you were brave enough, that you could get through enemy fire. So what you would do is create a target so that the majority of the enemy would fire. And upon them firing, then you would rush across about 200 yards. So some pretty fast people could make it in about 30 seconds, which was about the time that it took to reload their guns. So if you did this in the Civil War and the Crimean War, then you could pretty easily take the other side. But during World War I, they had what was called the machine gun, which made it so that someone who didn't really have any skill or aim could basically just take and move the gun around and wipe out the entire advancing army. It fired about 3 shots every second as opposed to one every 30 seconds. So 90 shots in the same time that they would fire one before, and it would annihilate the other side. The French, however, held on to the tactic that if you were brave enough, you could get through machine gun fire, much to their detriment and the large number of casualties faced by the French army. Tanks were invented also, but were not very effective due to the terrain and the trenches. And also invented during this time was a flamethrower, which can only be developed for the violent murder of other people. It would engulf anything in flames up to, well, by the end of the war they had one where if you stood in one end zone and they were standing in the other, it would go over 100 yards and roast the person in the opposing goal line. Now, trench warfare. We talked about this a little bit with the machine gun, but basically you stayed in trenches for protection. You would rise up every once in a while and shoot at the other side, but you spent the majority of the time with your shovel in your hand digging and making your trenches a little bit deeper and making it so that they would drain. You ate there, you slept there, you went to the bathroom there. If you died, you were buried there. The smell of death was everywhere. You could smell it from the people that died in the area between the trenches, which was known as no man's land. And there were rats everywhere and maggots. So if you're trying to look for a positive place to go and spend your vacation, you don't go into trench warfare during World War I. Everything about it was horrific, including the smells that came from it. And by the way, we haven't even gotten to some of the worst parts of trench warfare. Okay, this is what some of the trenches look like from the air. They would build these patterns so they weren't straight lines, so it was easier to put reinforcements in an area that were harder to see from the air. But there were long lines that led all the way back to the battlefront, so you could move troops in and out without them being subject to machine gun fire or bombings. You wouldn't always see them until it was too late. Now, inside the trenches, in addition to the other horrible conditions I gave you, 97% of the people had lice. So 32 out of every 33 people had head lice. So there was a big problem in the trenches with trench fever. Also, it's very important to keep yourself and your feet dry, because if they're wet for long periods of time, like if you're standing in a puddle in a trench fighting for days on end, your feet will get infected, they will start to swell, and it'll get to a point where they cannot be salvaged, and they will balloon up to 2 to 3 times the size, cut off circulation to your toes. And once that happens, the only thing you can do is defeat someone. Chop them both off if they're both infected. Now, I know you're thinking, can I buy this? Well, it gets worse, people. Then they introduce, for the first time in warfare, poison gas. Now, there are 3 types of poison gas. Number 1 was called a lacrimator or tearing agent. This is like your pepper spray or your mace. It would make you, tear up to the point where you were in horrible pain and, basically tears running down your face until your body got over it. And that would take anywhere from about an hour to sometimes days, depending on how high of a dose that you would be hit with. They had what was called an asphyxiant. This is chlorine gas, and with a strong shot of chlorine gas your way, it would burn your lungs so severely that you would cough up bits of them as you drown on your body's fluids that were trying to fix them. And number 3 was mustard gas. Mustard gas was the least deadly of the 3 that I'm talking about here, but once it hit you, it would cover you with blisters so heavy that they would split as you tried to move, and it attacked any place in your body where you had moisture, which would be your eyes, nose, mouth, and ears, your neck, your underarms, your rear and frontal crotchal regions, and anywhere else where you might be hot with sweat if you've been digging, which would be just about everywhere. And it would cover with layer and layer and layer of blisters. it took sometimes between 30 and 180 days for these to all clear up. So you might be completely deaf and blind during this time, but unable to move because of all the blisters on you. So again, not a great advertisement for World War One. Hey, pretty girl.
Yes, sir.
This heat feels good on my back. How's your back?
It's fine. I can't get into anything now. But
You have gotten into one thing. My good side. In fact, I'm going to warn you that you're about to receive, late for Valentine's Day, but a kissygram. I hope so, because you're my whole life. And in case you're looking for your phone, I found it.
my nose is so stuffy.
You want some Vicks?
No, that doesn't help it. It sounds bad.
But it keeps boogers from forming in your nose.
Are you sure about that?
It works for me.
Maybe.
Do you want it?
Sure.
Do you want it? Now, ultimately, the fighting would be done between two major groups. Now, the Triple Entente of Great Britain, France, and Russia was joined by Italy, whose feelings were hurt in an earlier campaign. The Central Powers, this is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and they got the help from the Ottoman Empire, also known as the Sick Man of Europe. Maybe not the best trade out for Italy, but then again, Italy really doesn't do much in this war. Unless you're Libya. Gallipoli. So, there was a real desire to take control of the trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So in order to do this, you had to control Gallipoli, the small peninsula. So, the thing was, the Ottoman Empire was in there. They had good control of what was going on. The British were short on forces, so they called on the New Zealanders and the Australians to go in and take this battle. But after 9 horrible, bloody months, it completely falls apart. Winston Churchill was in charge of this fight, and somehow he was able to get favor again after he had to resign from the British Navy. 1 out of every 2 people were either wounded or killed on the British side. The Turkish forces were, they had about a fifth of the people die, so about 46,000 people that died as compared to what the British lost. Anyway, it was quite horrible. If you want a boring movie about it, there's a movie called Gallipoli starring a young Mel Gibson. It's very, very depressing. It makes me sad. He has to watch his best friend die and he knows it's for nothing. It's kind of similar to the story that happened in 1917, if you saw that, except there's nothing good to the end of the movie. It's just all depressing all the time. A good, easy listening station for murder. Before World War One, the submarine was thought to be useless whenever you were trying to deal with another country, because at least with the technology that they had at the time, a submarine could only stay underwater for a couple of hours, and once it was, no longer underwater, it was an easy target to be taken out by the other side. But the Germans made it very effective by hitting not other naval ships, but any ships heading towards England, and sneaking into ports as well to cause damage and sneak out. So eventually they'll build anti-submarine barriers to keep out submarines, and but throughout the war, German U-boats, or Unterseeboots, which were nothing but the German word for submarine, they wreaked havoc on all the oceans. They used something called unrestricted submarine warfare. And part of this was because the British put a blockade to keep all shipping out of Germany. So, since Germany couldn't trade with the rest of the world and get supplies they needed for warfare, then Britain would be on their own as well. Be glad you're not a merchant that was alive during this time period. Uh, so, many ships were hit, but the most infamous of these was the Lusitania. Nearly 1,200 people lost their lives, including 138 Americans. The Germans, thinking it was a bad idea to get the U.S. involved and the millions of troops that might have come from that country, made a promise called the Sussex Pledge, where they said they would no longer sink merchant ships. When it was found that as soon as this promise was made, the Americans started sending weapons en masse to Great Britain, they reopened it. Now, if you look on the maps on the right-hand side, the top right one is 8 months before the Sussex Pledge was put into effect, where you'll see about 600 dots representing ships that were sunk during that short period of time. As soon as the Sussex Pledge was broken by the Germans, they sank around 1,000 ships in the next 8 months. So the Germans, it was ridiculous the number of ships that they sank. It was nearly 4,000 during the war. And realize that each one of these ships has more than one person on them. The Battle of Verdun. Okay, this is another battle that's being fought in France. So in Verdun, General Falkenhayn, please don't repeat that in the halls, was really trying to defeat France, and so they attacked a very important target to them. And the French were forced to deploy every able man to defend that target. And the idea was to kill off as many of the French army as possible, so they had no other people to stop the German advance into France. This is a horrible battle that lasts over a long period of time. People that were watching at Verdun, okay, here's from a French captain. 4 days and 4 nights, 96 hours, the last 2 days in ice-cold mud. Under relentless fire, without any protection. I arrived with 170 men. I returned with 34 half insane. A witness tells, we carried the smell of dead bodies with us, the bread we ate, the water we drank. Everything we touched smelled of decomposition, surrounding us with dead bodies. Many of the bodies would lay in no man's land for the next 3 years. Just rotting flesh and unrecognizable by the end of the war. Here's an image of what Verdun looked like before and after. Above and below, you see just the total destruction of the city, and it's really almost unrecognizable. In fact, if you look at the picture from the top to bottom on the left, only part of the tower helps you see that you were in the same city, and that beautiful area on the right that was just crushed. In Verdun, in just the first month of the offensive, there were 500,000 casualties on each side. The Somme, another battle between the Germans and the French and the British. This is one of the craziest ones. So, 6 days before the Battle of the Somme happens, the British fire 1.6 million shells at the Germans, non-stop, 24 hours a day for 6 days. So, thinking that the battle was over, the British sent troops in parade formation, thinking they beat the Germans. Now, the difference between the German and the British and French trenches was the Germans would build deep in the ground these bunkers where people could go in and sleep at night, so they weren't sleeping out in the open air like the British and the French were. Okay, so the British and the French could have done this, but didn't, because they were afraid that if they made things too comfortable at the front, they wouldn't be willing to fight the war. So the Germans survived all this bombing. Whenever they heard the bombing stop, they started to look up, and they had a lot of cover from smoke from all the bombs going off. And as they're looking up, they see all these British troops getting in formation as if they're marching. Okay, many of them they noticed hadn't even loaded their guns, and so once the British Army has gone to enter most of no man's land, marching towards the German side, the Germans popped up their machine guns quickly, and in 1 hour, 60,000 British soldiers were wiped out. Okay, another 30,000 in the hours that followed that. Just a lot of senseless deaths because they overestimated the enemy instead of going in with any other type of plan to protect anyone. Haig halted the battle in November. The Allies got 125 square miles. That's basically 12 miles by 10 miles, or about the size of Duncanville. Okay, so for the size of the city that we're in, the British lost 400,000 men, the French lost 200,000 men, and the Germans lost 450,000 men. So 1 million men were lost to take a city, or to take an area the size of Duncanville. And by the way, they were pushed back a couple of weeks later. So really, it was all for naught. The Battle of Ypres. Now, here's another battle being fought between the British, the French, and the Germans. And this is kind of another wasted battle because in this one you had a whole new way of killing people, and that was with poison gas. Okay? It's the first time poison gas was used in a battle, and High Command didn't go to the battlefield, and they continued to send battalion after battalion of men to their deaths. Okay, and the problem was, as they were going into no man's land, they would get hit with canisters of anything from chlorine gas, which would scorch your lungs so you couldn't breathe, and if you're lucky, you died quickly. If you weren't, they'd take you back to be taken care of, and you would die over the next few days, coughing up your lungs. Also, the tear gas would make it so that people couldn't see where they were going, and many of them would wander right into streams of machine guns going off. There were nearly 50,000 people that went missing in the trenches and were blasted into pieces by shell fire that was coming in. You know, because you still, in addition to poison gas, you also had artillery being fired, blasting massive holes in the ground. 1 out of every 4 shells by the last year of the war carried poisonous gas. And this becomes the testing ground for it, and there are 3 separate battles fought in the same location. Now, if you remember earlier in this unit, we talked about innovations that came about, and we had the airplane. Man had finally defeated the air and were able to fly. What a glorious moment in world history. However, within 10 years of its creation, we found a way to cause deaths with it. Okay? And the British and the French had many more planes than the Germans, but the Germans were very skilled pilots. They normally flew over their own land, and once the battle was over, there were prevailing winds that were blowing to the east, so they could ride those back home and basically use up all their fuel and just go back, refuel, and go back to fight again. Of these pilots, the greatest war ace was actually Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron, who shot down 80 planes. René Fonck of France was the greatest surviving ace. He shot down 75 planes. There were, I believe, 12 different pilots who shot down over 50 planes by themselves. They came up with all types of new innovations, starting with a machine gun that was connected to the motor, that whenever you fired, it fired between revolutions of the propellers so as not to damage them. and this would just escalate after World War One. This brings us to the end of today. I hope everyone's having a great day. I hope you got something out of it. I look forward to talking to you tomorrow. In the meantime, please don't cocaine, please don't AIDS, and please don't COVID. I want to see you again. Have a great day. This is Doug Dell signing out.